Chapter 34. Miss Pontifex soon found out that Ernest did not like games, but she saw also that he could hardly be expected to like them. He was perfectly well-shaped but unusually devoid of physical strength. He got a fair share of this in after life, but it came much later with him than with other boys, and at the time of which I am writing he was a mere little skeleton. He wanted something to develop his arms and chest without knocking him about as much as the school games did. To supply this want by some means which should add also to his pleasure was Alethea's first anxiety. Rowing would have answered every purpose, but unfortunately there was no river at Rubborough. Whatever it was to be, it must be something which he should like as much as other boys liked cricket or football, and he must think the wish for it to have come originally from himself. It was not very easy to find anything that would do, but ere long it occurred to her that she might enlist his love of music on her side, and asked him one day when he was spending a half-holiday at her house whether he would like her to buy an organ for him to play on. Of course, the boy said yes. Then she told him about her grandfather and the organs he had built. It had never entered into his head that he could make one, but when he gathered from what his aunt had said that this was not out of the question, he rose as eagerly to the bait as she could have desired, and wanted to begin learning to saw and plane so that he might make the wooden pipes at once. Miss Pontifex did not see how she could have hit upon anything more suitable, and she liked the idea that he would incidentally get a knowledge of carpentering, for she was impressed, perhaps foolishly, with the wisdom of the German custom which gives every boy a handicraft of some sort. Writing to me on this matter, she said, professions are all very well for those who have connection and interest as well as capital, but otherwise they are white elephants. How many men do not you and I know who have talent, assiduity, excellent good sense, straightforwardness, every quality in fact which should command success, and who yet go on from year to year waiting and hoping against hope for the work which never comes? How, indeed, is it likely to come unless to those who either are born with interest, or who marry in order to get it? Ernest's father and mother have no interest, and if they had they would not use it. I suppose they will make him a clergyman, or try to do so. Perhaps it is the best thing to do with him, for he could buy a living with the money his grandfather left him, but there is no knowing what the boy will think of it when the time comes. And for aught we know he may insist on going to the backwoods of America, as so many other young men are doing now, but, anyway, he would like making an organ, and this could do him no harm, so the sooner he began the better. Alethea thought it would save trouble in the end if she told her brother and sister-in-law of this scheme. I do not suppose, she wrote, that Dr. Skinner will approve very cordially of my attempt to introduce organ building into the curriculum of Rubborough, but I will see what I can do with him, for I have set my heart on owning an organ built by Ernest's own hands, which he may play on as much as he likes while it remains in my house and which I will lend him permanently as soon as he gets one of his own, but which is to be my property for the present, inasmuch as I mean to pay for it. This was put in to make it plain to Theobald and Christina that they should not be out of pocket in the matter. If Alethea had been as poor as the Misses Libby, the reader may guess what Ernest's papa and mamma would have said to this proposal, but then, if she had been as poor as they, she would never have made it. They did not like Ernest's getting more and more into his aunt's good books, still it was perhaps better that he should do so than that she should be driven back upon the John Pontifexes. The only thing, said Theobald, which made him hesitate, was that the boy might be thrown with low associates later on if he were to be encouraged in his taste for music, a taste which Theobald had always disliked. He had observed with regret that Ernest had ere now shown rather a hankering after low company, and he might make acquaintance with those who would corrupt his innocence. Christina shuddered at this, but when they had aired their scruples sufficiently they felt, and when people begin to feel, they are invariably going to take what they believe to be the more worldly course, that to oppose Alethea's proposal would be injuring their son's prospects more than was right, so they consented, but not too graciously. After a time, however, Christina got used to the idea, and then considerations occurred to her which made her throw herself into it with characteristic ardor. If Miss Pontifex had been a railway stock, she might have been said to have been buoyant in the Battersby market for some few days. Buoyant for long together she could never be, still for a time there really was an upward movement. Christina's mind wandered to the organ itself. She seemed to have made it with her own hands. There would be no other in England to compare with it for combined sweetness and power. She already heard the famous Dr. Walmesley of Cambridge mistaking it for a Father Smith. It would come, no doubt, in reality to Battersby Church, which wanted an organ, for it must be all nonsense about Alethea's wishing to keep it, and Ernest would not have a house of his own for ever so many years, and they could never have it at the rectory. Oh, no. Battersby Church was the only proper place for it. Of course, they would have a grand opening, and the bishop would come down, and perhaps young Figgins might be on a visit to them. She must ask Ernest if young Figgins had yet left Trubborough. He might even persuade his grandfather Lord Lonsford to be present. Lord Lonsford and the bishop and everyone else would then compliment her, and Dr. Wesley or Dr. Walmesley, who should preside, it did not much matter which, would say to her, "My dear Mrs. Pontifex, I never yet played upon so remarkable an instrument." Then she would give him one of her very sweetest smiles and say she feared he was flattering her, on which he would rejoin with some pleasant little trifle about remarkable men, the remarkable man being for the moment Ernest, having invariably had remarkable women for their mothers, and so on and so on. The advantage of doing one's praising for oneself is that one can lay it on so thick and exactly in the right places. Theobald wrote Ernest a short and surly letter apropos of his aunt's intentions in this matter. "I will not commit myself," he said, "to an opinion whether anything will come of it. This will depend entirely upon your own exertions. You have had singular advantages hitherto, and your kind aunt is showing every desire to befriend you. But you must give greater proof of stability and steadiness of character than you have given yet if this organ matter is not to prove in the end to be only one disappointment the more. I must insist on two things. Firstly, that this new iron in the fire does not distract your attention from your Latin and Greek. They aren't mine," thought Ernest, "and never have been, and secondly, that you bring no smell of glue or shavings into the house here, if you make any part of the organ during your holidays." Ernest was still too young to know how unpleasant a letter he was receiving. He believed the innuendos contained in it to be perfectly just. He knew he was sadly deficient in perseverance. He liked some things for a little while, and then found he did not like them any more, and this was as bad as anything well could be. His father's letter gave him one of his many fits of melancholy over his own worthlessness, but the thought of the organ consoled him, and he felt sure that here at any rate was something to which he could apply himself steadily without growing tired of it. It was settled that the organ was not to be begun before the Christmas holidays were over, and that till then Ernest should do a little plain carpentering, so as to get to know how to use his tools. Miss Pontifex had a carpenter's bench set up in an outhouse upon her own premises, and made terms with the most respectable carpenter in Rubborough, by which one of his men was to come for a couple of hours twice a week and set Ernest on the right way. Then she discovered she wanted this or that simple piece of work done, and gave the boy a commission to do it, paying him handsomely as well as finding him in tools and materials. She never gave him a syllable of good advice, or talked to him about everything's depending upon his own exertions, but she kissed him often, and would come into the workshop and act the part of one who took an interest in what was being done so cleverly as ere long to become really interested. What boy would not take kindly to almost anything with such assistance? All boys like making things. The exercise of sawing, planing and hammering, proved exactly what his aunt had wanted to find, something that should exercise, but not too much, and at the same time amuse him. When Ernest's sallow face was flushed with his work, and his eyes were sparkling with pleasure, he looked quite a different boy from the one his aunt had taken in hand only a few months earlier. His inner self never told him that this was humbug, as it did about Latin and Greek. Making stools and drawers was worth living for, and after Christmas there loomed the organ, which was scarcely ever absent from his mind. His aunt let him invite his friends, encouraging him to bring those whom her quick sense told her were the most desirable. She smartened him up also in his personal appearance, always without preaching to him. Indeed, she worked wonders during the short time that was allowed her, and if her life had been spared, I cannot think that my hero would have come under the shadow of that cloud which cast so heavy a gloom over his younger manhood, but unfortunately for him his gleam of sunshine was too hot and too brilliant to last, and he had many a storm yet to weather, before he became fairly happy. For the present, however, he was supremely so, and his aunt was happy and grateful for his happiness, the improvement she saw in him, and his unrepressed affection for herself. She became fonder of him from day to day in spite of his many faults and almost incredible foolishnesses. It was perhaps on account of these very things that she saw how much he had need of her, but at any rate, from whatever cause, she became strengthened in her determination to be to him in the place of parents, and to find in him a son rather than a nephew. But still she made no will. Chapter 35. All went well for the first part of the following half-year. Miss Pontifex spent the greater part of her holidays in London, and I also saw her at Rubborough, where I spent a few days, staying at the Swan. I heard all about my godson, in whom, however, I took less interest than I said I did. I took more interest in the stage at that time than in anything else, and as for Ernest, I found him a nuisance for engrossing so much of his aunt's attention, and taking her so much from London. The organ was begun, and made fair progress during the first 2 months of the half-year. Ernest was happier than he had ever been before, and was struggling upwards. The best boys took more notice of him for his aunt's sake, and he consorted less with those who led him into mischief. But much as Miss Pontifex had done, she could not all at once undo the effect of such surroundings as the boy had had at Battersby. Much as he feared and disliked his father, though he still knew not how much this was, he had caught much from him. If Theobald had been kinder, Ernest would have modelled himself upon him entirely, and ere long would probably have become as thorough a little prig as could have easily been found. Fortunately his temper had come to him from his mother, who, when not frightened, and when there was nothing on the horizon which might cross the slightest whim of her husband, was an amiable, good-natured woman. If it was not such an awful thing to say of anyone, I should say that she meant well. Ernest had also inherited his mother's love of building castles in the air, and, so I suppose it must be called, her vanity. He was very fond of showing off, and, provided he could attract attention, cared little from whom it came, nor what it was for. He caught up, parrot-like, whatever jargon he heard from his elders, which he thought was the correct thing, and aired it in season and out of season, as though it were his own. Miss Pontifex was old enough and wise enough to know that this is the way in which even the greatest men as a general rule begin to develop, and was more pleased with his receptiveness and reproductiveness than alarmed at the things he caught and reproduced. She saw that he was much attached to herself, and trusted to this rather than to anything else. She saw also that his conceit was not very profound, and that his fits of self-abasement were as extreme as his exaltation had been. His impulsiveness and sanguine trustfulness in anyone who smiled pleasantly at him, or indeed was not absolutely unkind to him, made her more anxious about him than any other point in his character. She saw clearly that he would have to find himself rudely undeceived many a time and oft, before he would learn to distinguish friend from foe within reasonable time. It was her perception of this which led her to take the action which she was so soon called upon to take. Her health was for the most part excellent, and she had never had a serious illness in her life. One morning, however, soon after Easter 1850, she awoke feeling seriously unwell. For some little time there had been a talk of fever in the neighborhood, but in those days the precautions that ought to be taken against the spread of infection were not so well understood as now, and nobody did anything. In a day or two it became plain that Miss Pontifex had got an attack of typhoid fever and was dangerously ill. On this she sent off a messenger to town, and desired him not to return without her lawyer and myself. We arrived on the afternoon of the day on which we had been summoned, and found her still free from delirium. Indeed, The cheery way in which she received us made it difficult to think she could be in danger. She at once explained her wishes, which had reference, as I expected, to her nephew, and repeated the substance of what I have already referred to as her main source of uneasiness concerning him. Then she begged me by our long and close intimacy, by the suddenness of the danger that had fallen on her and her powerlessness to avert it, to undertake what she said she well knew, if she died, would be an unpleasant and invidious trust. She wanted to leave the bulk of her money ostensibly to me, but in reality to her nephew, so that I should hold it in trust for him till he was 28 years old, but neither he nor anyone else, except her lawyer and myself, was to know anything about it. She would leave £5,000 in other legacies, and £15,000 to Ernest, which by the time he was 28 would have accumulated to, say, £30,000. Sell out the debentures, she said, where the money now is, and put it into Midland Ordinary. Let him make his mistakes, she said, upon the money his grandfather left him. I am no prophet, but even I can see that it will take that boy many years to see things as his neighbors see them. He will get no help from his father and mother, who would never forgive him for his good luck if I left him the money outright. I dare say I am wrong, but I think he will have to lose the greater part or all of what he has, before he will know how to keep what he will get from me. Supposing he went bankrupt before he was 28 years old, the money was to be mine absolutely, but she could trust me, she said, to hand it over to Ernest in due time. If, she continued, I am mistaken, the worst that can happen is that he will come into a larger sum at 28 instead of a smaller sum at, say, 23, for I would never trust him with it earlier, and, if he knows nothing about it he will not be unhappy for the want of it. She begged me to take £2,000 in return for the trouble I should have in taking charge of the boy's estate, and as a sign of the testatrix's hope that I would now and again look after him while he was still young. The remaining £3,000 I was to pay in legacies and annuities to friends and servants. In vain both her lawyer and myself remonstrated with her on the unusual and hazardous nature of this arrangement. We told her that sensible people will not take a more sanguine view concerning human nature than the courts of chancery do. We said, in fact, everything that anyone else would say. She admitted everything, but urged that her time was short, that nothing would induce her to leave her money to her nephew in the usual way. It is an unusually foolish will, she said, but he is an unusually foolish boy, and she smiled quite merrily at her little Sally. Like all the rest of her family, she was very stubborn when her mind was made up. So the thing was done as she wished it. No provision was made for either my death or Ernest's. Miss Pontifex had settled it that we were neither of us going to die, and was too ill to go into details. She was so anxious, moreover, to sign her will while still able to do so that we had practically no alternative but to do as she told us. If she recovered we could see things put on a more satisfactory footing, and further discussion would evidently impair her chances of recovery. It seemed then only too likely that it was a case of this will or no will at all. When the will was signed I wrote a letter in duplicate, saying that I held all Miss Pontifex had left me in trust for Ernest except as regards £5,000, but that he was not to come into the bequest, and was to know nothing whatever about it directly or indirectly, till he was 28 years old, and if he was bankrupt before he came into it the money was to be mine absolutely. At the foot of each letter Miss Pontifex wrote, "The above was my understanding when I made my will," and then signed her name. The solicitor and his clerk witnessed. I kept one copy myself and handed the other to Miss Pontifex's solicitor. When all this had been done she became more easy in her mind. She talked principally about her nephew. "Don't scold him," she said, "if he is volatile, and continually takes things up only to throw them down again. How can he find out his strength or weakness otherwise? A man's profession," she said, and here she gave one of her wicked little laughs, "is not like his wife, which he must take once for all, for better for worse, without proof beforehand. Let him go here and there, and learn his truest liking by finding out what, after all, he catches himself turning to most habitually, then let him stick to this, But I dare say Ernest will be 40 or 45 before he settles down. Then all his previous infidelities will work together to him for good if he is the boy I hope he is. Above all," she continued, "do not let him work up to his full strength, except once or twice in his lifetime. Nothing is well done nor worth doing unless, take it all round, it has come pretty easily." Theobald and Christina would give him a pinch of salt and tell him to put it on the tails of the 7 deadly virtues. Here she laughed again in her old manner, at once so mocking and so sweet. "I think if he likes pancakes he had perhaps better eat them on Shrove Tuesday, but this is enough." These were the last coherent words she spoke. From that time she grew continually worse, and was never free from delirium till her death, which took place less than a fortnight afterwards, to the inexpressible grief of those who knew and loved her. Chapter 36. Letters had been written to Miss Pontifex's brothers and sisters, and one and all came post haste to Rubborough. Before they arrived the poor lady was already delirious, and for the sake of her own peace at the last I am half glad she never recovered consciousness. I had known these people all their lives, as none can know each other but those who have played together as children. I knew how they had, all of them, perhaps Theobald least, but all of them more or less, made her life a burden to her until the death of her father had made her her own mistress, and I was displeased at their coming one after the other to Rubborough, and inquiring whether their sister had recovered consciousness sufficiently to be able to see them. It was known that she had sent for me on being taken ill, and that I remained at Rubborough, and I own I was angered by the mingled air of suspicion, defiance and inquisitiveness, with which they regarded me. They would all, except Theobald, I believe, have cut me downright if they had not believed me to know something they wanted to know themselves, and might have some chance of learning from me, for it was plain I had been in some way concerned with the making of their sister's will. None of them suspected what the ostensible nature of this would be, but I think they feared Miss Pontifex was about to leave money for public uses. John said to me in his blandest manner that he fancied he remembered to have heard his sister say that she thought of leaving money to found a college for the relief of dramatic authors in distress. To this I made no rejoinder, and I have no doubt his suspicions were deepened. When the end came, I got Miss Pontifex's solicitor to write and tell her brothers and sisters how she had left her money. They were not unnaturally furious, and went each to his or her separate home without attending the funeral, and without paying any attention to myself. This was perhaps the kindest thing they could have done by me, for their behavior made me so angry that I became almost reconciled to Alethea's will out of pleasure at the anger it had aroused. But for this I should have felt the will keenly, as having been placed by it in the position which of all others I had been most anxious to avoid, and as having saddled me with a very heavy responsibility. Still it was impossible for me to escape, and I could only let things take their course. Miss Pontifex had expressed a wish to be buried at Pelham. In the course of the next few days I therefore took the body thither. I had not been to Pelham since the death of my father some 6 years earlier. I had often wished to go there, but had shrunk from doing so, though my sister had been 2 or 3 times. I could not bear to see the house which had been my home for so many years of my life in the hands of strangers, to ring ceremoniously at a bell which I had never yet pulled except as a boy in jest, to feel that I had nothing to do with a garden in which I had in childhood gathered so many a nosegay, and which had seemed my own for many years after I had reached man's estate, to see the rooms bereft of every familiar feature, and made so unfamiliar in spite of their familiarity. Had there been any sufficient reason, I should have taken these things as a matter of course, and should no doubt have found them much worse in anticipation than in reality, but as there had been no special reason why I should go to Pelham I had hitherto avoided doing so. Now, however, my going was a necessity, and I confess I never felt more subdued than I did on arriving there with the dead playmate of my childhood. I found the village more changed than I had expected. The railway had come there, and a brand new yellow brick station was on the site of old Mr. and Mrs. Pontifex's cottage. Nothing but the carpenter's shop was now standing. I saw many faces I knew, but even in 6 years they seemed to have grown wonderfully older. Some of the very old were dead, and the old were getting very old in their stead. I felt like the changeling in the fairy story who came back after a 7 years' sleep. Everyone seemed glad to see me, though I had never given them particular cause to be so, and everyone who remembered old Mr. and Mrs. Pontifex spoke warmly of them and were pleased at their granddaughters wishing to be laid near them. Entering the churchyard and standing in the twilight of a gusty cloudy evening on the spot close beside old Mrs. Pontifex's grave which I had chosen for Alethea's, I thought of the many times that she, who would lie there henceforth, and I, who must surely lie one day in some such another place though when and where I knew not, had dreamt over this very spot as childish lovers together. Next morning I followed her to the grave, and in due course set up a plain upright slab to her memory as like as might be to those over the graves of her grandmother and grandfather. I gave the dates and places of her birth and death, but added nothing except that this stone was set up by one who had known and loved her. Knowing how fond she had been of music, I had been half inclined at one time to inscribe a few bars of music, if I could find any which seemed suitable to her character, but I knew how much she would have disliked anything singular in connection with her tombstone and did not do it. Before, however, I had come to this conclusion, I had thought that Ernest might be able to help me to the right thing, and had written to him upon the subject. The following is the answer I received. Dear Godpapa, I send you the best bit I can think of. It is the subject of the last of Handel's 6 grand fugues and goes thus: music score. It would do better for a man, especially for an old man who was very sorry for things, than for a woman, but I cannot think of anything better. If you do not like it for Aunt Alethea, I shall keep it for myself. Your affectionate godson, Ernest Pontifex. Was this the little lad who could get sweeties for 2d but not for 2d halfpenny? Dear, dear me, I thought to myself, how these babes and sucklings do give us the go-by surely. Choosing his own epitaph at 15 as for a man who had been very sorry for things, and such a strain as that, why it might have done for Leonardo da Vinci himself. Then I set the boy down as a conceited young jackanapes, which no doubt he was, but so are a great many other young people of Ernest's age. Chapter 37. If Theobald and Christina had not been too well pleased when Miss Pontifex first took Ernest in hand, they were still less so when the connection between the two was interrupted so prematurely. They said they had made sure from what their sister had said that she was going to make Ernest her heir. I do not think she had given them so much as a hint to this effect. Theobald indeed gave Ernest to understand that she had done so in a letter which will be given shortly, but if Theobald wanted to make himself disagreeable, a trifle light as air would forthwith assume in his imagination whatever form was most convenient to him. I do not think they had even made up their minds what Alethea was to do with her money before they knew of her being at the point of death, and as I have said already, if they had thought it likely that Ernest would be made heir over their own heads without their having at any rate a life interest in the bequest, they would have soon thrown obstacles in the way of further intimacy between aunt and nephew. This, however, did not bar their right to feeling aggrieved now that neither they nor Ernest had taken anything at all, and they could profess disappointment on their boy's behalf which they would have been too proud to admit upon their own. In fact, it was only amiable of them to be disappointed under these circumstances. Christina said that the will was simply fraudulent, and was convinced that it could be upset if she and Theobald went the right way to work. Theobald, she said, should go before the Lord Chancellor, not in full court but in chambers, where he could explain the whole matter, or, perhaps it would be even better if she were to go herself, and I dare not trust myself to describe the reverie to which this last idea gave rise. I believe in the end Theobald died, and the Lord Chancellor, who had become a widower a few weeks earlier, made her an offer, which, however, she firmly but not ungratefully declined. She should ever, she said, continue to think of him as a friend. At this point the cook came in, saying the butcher had called, and what would she please to order? I think Theobald must have had an idea that there was something behind the bequest to me, but he said nothing about it to Christina. He was angry and felt wronged, because he could not get at Alethea to give her a piece of his mind any more than he had been able to get at his father. "It is so mean of people," he exclaimed to himself, "to inflict an injury of this sort, and then shirk facing those whom they have injured. Let us hope that, at any rate, they and I may meet in heaven." But of this he was doubtful, for when people had done so great a wrong as this, it was hardly to be supposed that they would go to heaven at all, and as for his meeting them in another place, the idea never so much as entered his mind. Once so angry and, of late, so little used to contradiction might be trusted, however, to avenge himself upon someone, and Theobald had long since developed the organ, by means of which he might vent spleen with least risk and greatest satisfaction to himself. This organ, it may be guessed, was nothing else than Ernest. To Ernest therefore he proceeded to unburden himself, not personally, but by letter. "You ought to know," he wrote, "that your Aunt Alethea had given your mother and me to understand that it was her wish to make you her heir, in the event, of course, of your conducting yourself in such a manner as to give her confidence in you. As a matter of fact, however, she has left you nothing, and the whole of her property has gone to your godfather, Mr. Overton. Your mother and I are willing to hope that if she had lived longer you would yet have succeeded in winning her good opinion, but it is too late to think of this now. The carpentering and organ building must at once be discontinued. I never believed in the project, and have seen no reason to alter my original opinion. I am not sorry for your own sake, that it is to be at an end, nor, I am sure, will you regret it yourself in after years. A few words more as regards your own prospects. You have, as I believe you know, a small inheritance, which is yours legally under your grandfather's will. This bequest was made inadvertently, and, I believe, entirely through a misunderstanding on the lawyer's part. The bequest was probably intended not to take effect till after the death of your mother and myself. Nevertheless, as the will is actually worded, it will now be at your command if you live to be 21 years old. From this, however, large deductions must be made. There will be legacy duty, and I do not know whether I am not entitled to deduct the expenses of your education and maintenance from birth to your coming of age. I shall not in all likelihood insist on this right to the full, if you conduct yourself properly, but a considerable sum should certainly be deducted. There will therefore remain very little, say £1,000 or £2,000 at the outside, as what will be actually yours, but the strictest account shall be rendered you in due time. This, let me warn you most seriously, is all that you must expect from me. Even Ernest saw that it was not from Theobald at all, at any rate till after my death, which for aught any of us know may be yet many years distant. It is not a large sum, but it is sufficient if supplemented by steadiness and earnestness of purpose. Your mother and I gave you the name Ernest, hoping that it would remind you continually of, but I really cannot copy more of this effusion. It was all the same old will-shaking game and came practically to this, that Ernest was no good, and that if he went on as he was going on now, he would probably have to go about the streets begging without any shoes or stockings soon after he had left school, or at any rate, college, and that he, Theobald, and Christina were almost too good for this world altogether. After he had written this Theobald felt quite good-natured, and sent to the Mrs. Thompson of the moment even more soup and wine than her usual not a liberal allowance. Ernest was deeply, passionately upset by his father's letter, to think that even his dear aunt, the one person of his relations whom he really loved, should have turned against him and thought badly of him after all. This was the unkindest cut of all. In the hurry of her illness Miss Pontifex, while thinking only of his welfare, had omitted to make such small present mention of him as would have made his father's innuendos stingless, and her illness being infectious, she had not seen him after its nature was known. I myself did not know of Theobald's letter, nor think enough about my godson to guess what might easily be his state. It was not till many years afterwards that I found Theobald's letter in the pocket of an old portfolio which Ernest had used at school, and in which other old letters and school documents were collected which I have used in this book. He had forgotten that he had it, but told me when he saw it that he remembered it as the first thing that made him begin to rise against his father in a rebellion which he recognized as righteous, though he dared not openly avow it. Not the least serious thing was that it would, he feared, be his duty to give up the legacy his grandfather had left him, for if it was his only through a mistake, how could he keep it? During the rest of the half-year Ernest was listless and unhappy. He was very fond of some of his schoolfellows, but afraid of those whom he believed to be better than himself, and prone to idealize everyone into being his superior except those who were obviously a good deal beneath him. He held himself much too cheap, and because he was without that physical strength and vigor which he so much coveted, and also because he knew he shirked his lessons, he believed that he was without anything which could deserve the name of a good quality. He was naturally bad, and one of those for whom there was no place for repentance, though he sought it even with tears. So he shrank out of sight of those whom in his boyish way he idolized, never for a moment suspecting that he might have capacities to the full as high as theirs though of a different kind, and fell in more with those who were reputed of the baser sort, with whom he could at any rate be upon equal terms. Before the end of the half-year he had dropped from the estate to which he had been raised during his aunt's stay at Rubborough, and his old dejection, varied, however, with bursts of conceit rivaling those of his mother, resumed its sway over him. "Pontifex," said Dr. Skinner, who had fallen upon him in hall one day like a moral landslip, before he had time to escape, "do you never laugh? Do you always look so preternaturally grave?" The doctor had not meant to be unkind, but the boy turned crimson, and escaped. There was one place only where he was happy, and that was in the old church of St. Michael, when his friend the organist was practicing. About this time cheap editions of the great oratorios began to appear, and Ernest got them all as soon as they were published. He would sometimes sell a school book to a second-hand dealer, and buy a number or two of the Messiah, or the Creation, or Elijah, with the proceeds. This was simply cheating his papa and mamma, but Ernest was falling low again, or thought he was, and he wanted the music much, and the sust, or whatever it was, little. Sometimes the organist would go home, leaving his keys with Ernest, so that he could play by himself and lock up the organ and the church in time to get back for calling over. At other times, while his friend was playing, he would wander round the church, looking at the monuments and the old stained glass windows, enchanted as regards both ears and eyes, at once. Once the old rector got hold of him as he was watching a new window being put in, which the rector had bought in Germany, the work, it was supposed, of Albert Dürer. He questioned Ernest, and finding that he was fond of music, he said in his old trembling voice, for he was over 80, "Then you should have known Dr. Burney, who wrote the history of music. I knew him exceedingly well when I was a young man." That made Ernest's heart beat, for he knew that Dr. Burney, when a boy at school at Chester, used to break bounds that he might watch Handel smoking his pipe in the Exchange Coffee House, and now he was in the presence of one who, if he had not seen Handel himself, had at least seen those who had seen him. These were oases in his desert, but, as a general rule, the boy looked thin and pale, and as though he had a secret which depressed him, which no doubt he had, but for which I cannot blame him. He rose, in spite of himself, higher in the school, but fell ever into deeper and deeper disgrace with the masters, and did not gain in the opinion of those boys about whom he was persuaded that they could assuredly never know what it was to have a secret weighing upon their minds. This was what Ernest felt so keenly. He did not much care about the boys who liked him, and idolized some who kept him as far as possible at a distance, but this is pretty much the case with all boys everywhere. At last things reached a crisis, below which they could not very well go, for at the end of the half-year but one after his aunt's death, Ernest brought back a document in his portmanteau, which Theobald stigmatized as infamous and outrageous. I need hardly say I am alluding to his school bill. This document was always a source of anxiety to Ernest, for it was gone into with scrupulous care, and he was a good deal cross-examined about it. He would sometimes write in for articles necessary for his education, such as a portfolio, or a dictionary, and sell the same, as I have explained, in order to eke out his pocket money, probably to buy either music or tobacco. These frauds were sometimes, as Ernest thought, in imminent danger of being discovered, and it was a load off his breast when the cross-examination was safely over. This time Theobald had made a great fuss about the extras, but had grudgingly passed them. It was another matter, however, with the character and the moral statistics, with which the bill concluded. The page on which these details were to be found was as follows: Report of the conduct and progress of Ernest Pontifex. Upper Fifth Form, half-year ending Midsummer 1851. Classics, idle, listless and unimproving. Mathematics divinity conduct in-house. Orderly. General conduct, not satisfactory, on account of his great unpunctuality and inattention to duties. Monthly merit money 1s. 6d. 6d. 0d. 6d. Total 2s. 6d. Number of merit marks 20110. Total 4. Number of penal marks 26 20 25 30 25. Total 126. Number of extra penals 9 6 10 12 11. Total 48. I recommend that his pocket money be made to depend upon his merit money. S. Skinner, Headmaster. Chapter 38. Ernest was thus in disgrace from the beginning of the holidays, but an incident soon occurred which led him into delinquencies compared with which all his previous sins were venial. Among the servants at the rectory was a remarkably pretty girl named Ellen. She came from Devonshire, and was the daughter of a fisherman who had been drowned when she was a child. Her mother set up a small shop in the village where her husband had lived, and just managed to make a living. Ellen remained with her till she was 14, when she first went out to service. 4 years later, when she was about 18, but so well grown that she might have passed for 20, she had been strongly recommended to Christina, who was then in want of a housemaid, and had now been at Battersby about 12 months. As I have said, the girl was remarkably pretty. She looked the perfection of health and good temper. Indeed, there was a serene expression upon her face which captivated almost all who saw her. She looked as if matters had always gone well with her and were always going to do so, and as if no conceivable combination of circumstances could put her for long together out of temper either with herself or with anyone else. Her complexion was clear, but high, her eyes were grey and beautifully shaped, her lips were full and restful, with something of an Egyptian sphinx-like character about them. When I learned that she came from Devonshire, I fancied I saw a strain of far-away Egyptian blood in her, for I had heard, though I know not what foundation there was for the story, that the Egyptians made settlements on the coast of Devonshire and Cornwall long before the Romans conquered Britain. Her hair was a rich brown, and her figure, of about the middle height, perfect, but erring if at all on the side of robustness. Altogether she was one of those girls about whom one is inclined to wonder how they can remain unmarried a week or a day longer. Her face, as indeed faces generally are, though I grant they lie sometimes, was a fair index to her disposition. She was good nature itself, and everyone in the house, not excluding I believe even Theobald himself after a fashion, was fond of her. As for Christina, she took the very warmest interest in her, and used to have her into the dining room twice a week, and prepare her for confirmation, for by some accident she had never been confirmed, by explaining to her the geography of Palestine and the routes taken by St. Paul on his various journeys in Asia Minor. When Bishop Treadwell did actually come down to Battersby and hold a confirmation there, Christina had her wish. He slept at Battersby, and she had a grand dinner party for him, and called him my lord several times. He was so much struck with her pretty face and modest demeanor when he laid his hands upon her that he asked Christina about her. When she replied that Helen was one of her own servants, the bishop seemed, so she thought or chose to think, quite pleased that so pretty a girl should have found so exceptionally good a situation. Ernest used to get up early during the holidays so that he might play the piano before breakfast without disturbing his papa and mamma, or rather, perhaps, without being disturbed by them. Ellen would generally be there sweeping the drawing-room floor and dusting while he was playing, and the boy, who was ready to make friends with most people, soon became very fond of her. He was not as a general rule sensitive to the charms of the fair sex, indeed he had hardly been thrown in with any women except his Aunt Solobe, and his Aunt Alethea, his mother, his sisters Charlotte and Mrs. J. Sometimes also he had had to take off his hat to the Miss Skinners, and had felt as if he should sink into the earth on doing so, but his shyness had worn off with Ellen, and the pair had become fast friends. Perhaps it was well that Ernest was not at home for very long together, but as yet his affection though hearty was quite platonic. He was not only innocent, but deplorably, I might even say guiltily innocent. His preference was based upon the fact that Ellen never scolded him, but was always smiling and good-tempered, besides she used to like to hear him play, and this gave him additional zest in playing. The morning access to the piano was indeed the one distinct advantage which the holidays had in Ernest's eyes, for at school he could not get at a piano except quasi-surreptitiously at the shop of Mr. Pearsall, the music seller. On returning this midsummer he was shocked to find his favorite looking pale and ill. All her good spirits had left her, the roses had fled from her cheek, and she seemed on the point of going into a decline. She said she was unhappy about her mother, whose health was failing, and was afraid she was herself not long for this world. Christina, of course, noticed the change. "I have often remarked," she said, "that those very fresh-colored, healthy-looking girls are the first to break up. I have given her calomel and James's powders repeatedly, and though she does not like it, I think I must show her to Dr. Martin when he next comes here." "Very well, my dear," said Theobald, and so next time Dr. Martin came Ellen was sent for. Dr. Martin soon discovered what would probably have been apparent to Christina herself if she had been able to conceive of such an ailment in connection with a servant who lived under the same roof as Theobald and herself, the purity of whose married life should have preserved all unmarried people who came near them from any taint of mischief. When it was discovered that in 3 or 4 months more Ellen would become a mother, Christina's natural good nature would have prompted her to deal as leniently with the case as she could, if she had not been panic-stricken lest any mercy on her and Theobald's part should be construed into toleration, however partial, of so great a sin. Hereon she dashed off into the conviction that the only thing to do was to pay Ellen her wages, and pack her off on the instant bag and baggage out of the house which Purity had more especially and particularly singled out for its abiding city. When she thought of the fearful contamination which Ellen's continued presence even for a week would occasion, she could not hesitate. Then came the question, horrid thought ! As to who was the partner of Ellen's guilt. Could it be, her own son, her darling Ernest? Ernest was getting a big boy now. She could excuse any young woman for taking a fancy to him. As for himself, why she was sure he was behind no young man of his age in appreciation of the charms of a nice-looking young woman. So long as he was innocent she did not mind this, but oh, if he were guilty! She could not bear to think of it, and yet it would be mere cowardice not to look such a matter in the face. Her hope was in the Lord, and she was ready to bear cheerfully and make the best of any suffering he might think fit to lay upon her. That the baby must be either a boy or girl, this much, at any rate, was clear. No less clear was it that the child, if a boy, would resemble Theobald, and if a girl, herself. Resemblance, whether of body or mind, generally leaped over a generation. The guilt of the parents must not be shared by the innocent offspring of shame. Oh! No, and such a child as this would be, she was off in one of her reveries at once. The child was in the act of being consecrated Archbishop of Canterbury when Theobald came in from a visit in the parish, and was told of the shocking discovery. Christina said nothing about Ernest, and I believe was more than half angry when the blame was laid upon other shoulders. She was easily consoled, however, and fell back on the double reflection, firstly, that her son was pure, and secondly, that she was quite sure he would not have been so had it not been for his religious convictions which had held him back, as, of course, it was only to be expected they would. Theobald agreed that no time must be lost in paying Ellen her wages and packing her off. So this was done, and less than 2 hours after Dr. Martin had entered the house, Ellen was sitting beside John the coachman, with her face muffled up so that it could not be seen, weeping bitterly as she was being driven to the station. Chapter 39. Ernest had been out all the morning, but came into the yard of the rectory from the spinney behind the house just as Ellen's things were being put into the carriage. He thought it was Ellen whom he then saw get into the carriage, but as her face had been hidden by her handkerchief he had not been able to see plainly who it was, and dismissed the idea as improbable. He went to the back kitchen window, at which the cook was standing peeling the potatoes for dinner, and found her crying bitterly. Ernest was much distressed, for he liked the cook, and, of course, wanted to know what all the matter was, who it was that had just gone off in the pony carriage, and why. The cook told him it was Ellen, but said that no earthly power should make it cross her lips why it was she was going away. When, however, Ernest took her au pied de la lettre and asked no further questions, she told him all about it after extorting the most solemn promises of secrecy. It took Ernest some minutes to arrive at the facts of the case, but when he understood them he leaned against the pump, which stood near the back kitchen window, and mingled his tears with the cook's. Then his blood began to boil within him. He did not see that after all his father and mother could have done much otherwise than they actually did. They might perhaps have been less precipitate, and tried to keep the matter a little more quiet, but this would not have been easy, nor would it have mended things very materially. The bitter fact remains that if a girl does certain things she must do them at her peril, no matter how young and pretty she is nor to what temptation she has succumbed. This is the way of the world, and as yet there has been no help found for it. Ernest could only see what he gathered from the cook, namely, that his favorite, Ellen, was being turned adrift with a matter of £3 in her pocket, to go she knew not where, and to do she knew not what, and that she had said she should hang or drown herself, which the boy implicitly believed she would. With greater promptitude than he had shown yet, he reckoned up his money and found he had 2 shillings and threepence at his command. There was his knife which might sell for a shilling, and there was the silver watch his Aunt Alethea had given him shortly before she died. The carriage had been gone now a full quarter of an hour, and it must have got some distance ahead, but he would do his best to catch it up, and there were short cuts which would perhaps give him a chance. He was off at once, and from the top of the hill just past the rectory paddock he could see the carriage, looking very small, on a bit of road which showed perhaps a mile and a half in front of him. One of the most popular amusements at Trubborough was an institution called the Hounds, more commonly known elsewhere as Hare and Hounds, but in this case the hare was a couple of boys who were called foxes, and boys are so particular about correctness of nomenclature where their sports are concerned that I dare not say they played hare and hounds. These were the hounds, and that was all. Ernest's want of muscular strength did not tell against him here. There was no jostling up against boys who, though neither older nor taller than he, were yet more robustly built. If it came to mere endurance he was as good as anyone else, so when his carpentering was stopped he had naturally taken to the hounds as his favorite amusement. His lungs thus exercised had become developed, and as a run of 6 or 7 miles across country was not more than he was used to, he did not despair by the help of the short cuts of overtaking the carriage, or at the worst of catching Ellen at the station before the train left. So he ran and ran and ran till his first wind was gone and his second came, and he could breathe more easily. Never with the hounds had he run so fast and with so few breaks as now, but with all his efforts and the help of the short cuts he did not catch up the carriage, and would probably not have done so had not John happened to turn his head and seen him running and making signs for the carriage to stop a quarter of a mile off. He was now about 5 miles from home, and was nearly done up. He was crimson with his exertion, covered with dust, and with his trousers and coat sleeves a trifle short for him he cut a poor figure enough as he thrust on Ellen his watch, his knife, and the little money he had. The one thing he implored of her was not to do those dreadful things which she threatened, for his sake if for no other reason. Ellen at first would not hear of taking anything from him, but the coachman, who was from the north country, sided with Ernest. "Take it, my lass," he said kindly, Take what thou canst get whiles thou canst get it. As for Master Ernest here, he has run well after thee, therefore let him give thee what he is minded." Ellen did what she was told, and the two parted with many tears, the girl's last words being that she should never forget him, and that they should meet again hereafter. She was sure they should, and then she would repay him. Then Ernest got into a field by the roadside, flung himself on the grass, and waited under the shadow of a hedge till the carriage should pass on its return from the station and pick him up, for he was dead beat. Thoughts which had already occurred to him with some force now came more strongly before him, and he saw that he had got himself into one mess, or rather into half a dozen messes, the more. In the first place he should be late for dinner, and this was one of the offences on which Theobald had no mercy. Also he should have to say where he had been, and there was a danger of being found out if he did not speak the truth. Not only this, but sooner or later it must come out that he was no longer possessed of the beautiful watch which his dear aunt had given him, and what, pray, had he done with it, or how had he lost it? The reader will know very well what he ought to have done. He should have gone straight home, and if questioned should have said, "I have been running after the carriage to catch our housemaid Ellen, whom I am very fond of. I have given her my watch, my knife and all my pocket money, so that I have now no pocket money at all and shall probably ask you for some more sooner than I otherwise might have done, and you will also have to buy me a new watch and a knife." But then fancy the consternation which such an announcement would have occasioned. Fancy the scowl and flashing eyes of the infuriated Theobald. "You unprincipled young scoundrel," he would exclaim, "do you mean to vilify your own parents by implying that they have dealt harshly by one whose profligacy has disgraced their house?" Or he might take it with one of those sallies of sarcastic calm, of which he believed himself to be a master. "Very well, Ernest, very well, I shall say nothing, you can please yourself. You are not yet 21, but pray act as if you were your own master. Your poor aunt doubtless gave you the watch that you might fling it away upon the first improper character you came across. I think I can now understand, however, why she did not leave you her money, and, after all, your godfather may just as well have it as the kind of people on whom you would lavish it if it were yours." Then his mother would burst into tears and implore him to repent and seek the things belonging to his peace while there was yet time, by falling on his knees to Theobald and assuring him of his unfailing love for him as the kindest and tenderest father in the universe. Ernest could do all this just as well as they could, and now, as he lay on the grass, speeches, some one or other of which was as certain to come as the sun to set, kept running in his head till they confuted the idea of telling the truth by reducing it to an absurdity. Truth might be heroic, but it was not within the range of practical domestic politics. Having settled then that he was to tell a lie, what lie should he tell? Should he say he had been robbed? He had enough imagination to know that he had not enough imagination to carry him out here. Young as he was, his instinct told him that the best liar is he who makes the smallest amount of lying go the longest way, who husbands it too carefully to waste it where it can be dispensed with. The simplest course would be to say that he had lost the watch, and was late for dinner because he had been looking for it. He had been out for a long walk, he chose the line across the fields that he had actually taken, and the weather being very hot, he had taken off his coat and waistcoat. In carrying them over his arm his watch, his money, and his knife had dropped out of them. He had got nearly home when he found out his loss, and had run back as fast as he could, looking along the line he had followed, till at last he had given it up. Seeing the carriage coming back from the station, he had let it pick him up and bring him home. This covered everything, the running and all, for his face still showed that he must have been running hard. The only question was whether he had been seen about the rectory by any but the servants for a couple of hours or so before Ellen had gone, and this he was happy to believe was not the case, for he had been out except during his few minutes' interview with the cook. His father had been out in the parish, his mother had certainly not come across him, and his brother and sister had also been out with the governess. He knew he could depend upon the cook and the other servants, the coachman would see to this, on the whole. Therefore, Both he and the coachman thought the story as proposed by Ernest would about meet the requirements of the case. Chapter 40. When Ernest got home and sneaked in through the back door, he heard his father's voice in its angriest tones, inquiring whether Master Ernest had already returned. He felt as Jack must have felt in the story of Jack and the Beanstalk, when from the oven in which he was hidden he heard the ogre ask his wife what young children she had got for his supper. With much courage, and, as the event proved, with not less courage than discretion, he took the bull by the horns, and announced himself at once as having just come in after having met with a terrible misfortune. Little by little he told his story, and though Theobald stormed somewhat at his incredible folly and carelessness, he got off better than he expected. Theobald and Christina had indeed at first been inclined to connect his absence from dinner with Ellen's dismissal, but on finding it clear, as Theobald said, everything was always clear with Theobald, that Ernest had not been in the house all the morning, and could therefore have known nothing of what had happened, he was acquitted on this account for once in a way, without a stain upon his character. Perhaps Theobald was in a good temper. He may have seen from the paper that morning that his stocks had been rising, it may have been this or 20 other things, but whatever it was, he did not scold so much as Ernest had expected, and, seeing the boy look exhausted and believing him to be much grieved at the loss of his watch, Theobald actually prescribed a glass of wine after his dinner, which, strange to say, did not choke him, but made him see things more cheerfully than was usual with him. That night when he said his prayers, he inserted a few paragraphs to the effect that he might not be discovered, and that things might go well with Ellen, but he was anxious and ill at ease. His guilty conscience pointed out to him a score of weak places in his story, through any one of which detection might even yet easily enter. Next day and for many days afterwards he fled when no man was pursuing, and trembled each time he heard his father's voice calling for him. He had already so many causes of anxiety that he could stand little more, and in spite of all his endeavors to look cheerful, even his mother could see that something was preying upon his mind. Then the idea returned to her that, after all, her son might not be innocent in the Ellen matter, and this was so interesting that she felt bound to get as near the truth as she could. "Come here, my poor, pale-faced, heavy-eyed boy," she said to him one day in her kindest manner. "Come and sit down by me, and we will have a little quiet confidential talk together, will we not?" The boy went mechanically to the sofa. Whenever his mother wanted what she called a confidential talk with him, she always selected the sofa as the most suitable ground on which to open her campaign. All mothers do this, the sofa is to them what the dining room is to fathers. In the present case the sofa was particularly well adapted for a strategic purpose, being an old-fashioned one with a high back, mattress, bolsters and cushions. Once safely pinned into one of its deep corners, it was like a dentist's chair, not too easy to get out of again. Here she could get at him better to pull him about, if this should seem desirable, or if she thought fit to cry she could bury her head in the sofa cushion and abandon herself to an agony of grief which seldom failed of its effect. None of her favorite maneuvers were so easily adopted in her usual seat, the armchair on the right-hand side of the fireplace, and so well did her son know from his mother's tone that this was going to be a sofa conversation that he took his place like a lamb as soon as she began to speak and before she could reach the sofa herself. "My dearest boy," began his mother, taking hold of his hand and placing it within her own, "promise me never to be afraid either of your dear papa or of me. Promise me this, my dear, as you love me, promise it to me," and she kissed him again and stroked his hair. But with her other hand she still kept hold of his, she had got him and she meant to keep him. The lad hung down his head and promised. What else could he do? "You know there is no one, dear Ernest, who loves you so much as your papa and I do, no one who watches so carefully over your interests or who is so anxious to enter into all your little joys and troubles as we are, but my dearest boy, it grieves me to think sometimes that you have not that perfect love for and confidence in us which you ought to have. You know, my darling, that it would be as much our pleasure as our duty to watch over the development of your moral and spiritual nature, but alas, you will not let us see your moral and spiritual nature. At times we are almost inclined to doubt whether you have a moral and spiritual nature at all. Of your inner life, my dear, we know nothing beyond such scraps as we can glean in spite of you, from little things which escape you almost before you know that you have said them." The boy winced at this. It made him feel hot and uncomfortable all over. He knew well how careful he ought to be, and yet, do what he could, from time to time his forgetfulness of the part betrayed him into unreserve. His mother saw that he winced, and enjoyed the scratch she had given him. Had she felt less confident of victory, she had better have foregone the pleasure of touching as it were the eyes at the end of the snail's horns in order to enjoy seeing the snail draw them in again, but she knew that when she had got him well down into the sofa, and held his hand, she had the enemy almost absolutely at her mercy, and could do pretty much what she liked. "Papa does not feel," she continued, "that you love him with that fullness and unreserve which would prompt you to have no concealment from him, and to tell him everything freely and fearlessly as your most loving earthly friend next only to your heavenly Father. Perfect love, as we know, casteth out fear. Your Father loves you perfectly, my darling, but he does not feel as though you loved him perfectly in return. If you fear him, it is because you do not love him as he deserves, and I know it sometimes cuts him to the very heart to think that he has earned from you a deeper and more willing sympathy than you display towards him. Oh, Ernest, Ernest, do not grieve one who is so good and noble-hearted by conduct which I can call by no other name than ingratitude." Ernest could never stand being spoken to in this way by his mother, for he still believed that she loved him, and that he was fond of her and had a friend in her, up to a certain point. But his mother was beginning to come to the end of her tether. She had played the domestic confidence trick upon him times without number already. Over and over again had she wheedled from him all she wanted to know, and afterwards got him into the most horrible scrape by telling the whole to Theobald. Ernest had remonstrated more than once upon these occasions, and had pointed out to his mother how disastrous to him his confidences had been, but Christina had always joined issue with him and showed him in the clearest possible manner that in each case she had been right, and that he could not reasonably complain. Generally it was her conscience that forbade her to be silent, and against this there was no appeal, for we are all bound to follow the dictates of our conscience. Ernest used to have to recite a hymn about conscience. It was to the effect that if you did not pay attention to its voice it would soon leave off speaking. "My mamma's conscience has not left off speaking," said Ernest to one of his chums at Truborough, "it's always jabbering." When a boy has once spoken so disrespectfully as this about his mother's conscience, it is practically all over between him and her. Ernest, through sheer force of habit, of the sofa, and of the return of the associated ideas, was still so moved by the siren's voice as to yearn to sail towards her, and fling himself into her arms, but it would not do. There were other associated ideas that returned also, and the mangled bones of too many murdered confessions were lying whitening round the skirts of his mother's dress, to allow him by any possibility to trust her further. So he hung his head and looked sheepish, but kept his own counsel. "I see, my dearest," continued his mother, "either that I am mistaken, and that there is nothing on your mind, or that you will not unburden yourself to me, but oh, Ernest, tell me at least this much, is there nothing that you repent of, nothing which makes you unhappy in connection with that miserable girl Ellen?" Ernest's heart failed him. "I am a dead boy now," he said to himself. He had not the faintest conception what his mother was driving at, and thought she suspected about the watch, but he held his ground. I do not believe he was much more of a coward than his neighbors, only he did not know that all sensible people are cowards when they are off their beat, or when they think they are going to be roughly handled. I believe that if the truth were known, it would be found that even the valiant Saint Michael himself tried hard to shirk his famous combat with the dragon. He pretended not to see all sorts of misconduct on the dragon's part, shut his eyes to the eating up of I do not know how many hundreds of men, women and children whom he had promised to protect, allowed himself to be publicly insulted a dozen times over without resenting it, and in the end, when even an angel could stand it no longer, he shilly-shallied untemporized an unconscionable time before he would fix the day and hour for the encounter. As for the actual combat, it was much such another wurra-wurra as Mrs. Ellaby had had with the young man who had in the end married her eldest daughter, till after a time, behold, there was the dragon lying dead, while he was himself alive and not very seriously hurt after all. "I do not know what you mean, Mamma," exclaimed Ernest anxiously and more or less hurriedly. His mother construed his manner into indignation at being suspected, and being rather frightened herself, she turned tail and scuttled off as fast as her tongue could carry her. "Oh," she said, "I see by your tone that you are innocent. Oh, oh, how I thank my Heavenly Father for this. May He for His dear Son's sake keep you always pure. Your father, my dear," here she spoke hurriedly but gave him a searching look, "was as pure as a spotless angel when he came to me. Like him, always be self-denying, truly truthful both in word and deed, never forgetful whose son and grandson you are, nor of the name we gave you, of the sacred stream in whose waters your sins were washed out of you through the blood and blessing of Christ," etc. But Ernest cut this, I will not say short, but a great deal shorter than it would have been if Christina had had her say out, by extricating himself from his mamma's embrace and showing a clean pair of heels. As he got near the purlieus of the kitchen, where he was more at ease, he heard his father calling for his mother, and again his guilty conscience rose against him. "He has found all out now," it cried, "and he is going to tell Mamma. This time I am done for." But there was nothing in it, his father only wanted the key of the cellaret. Then Ernest slunk off into a coppice or spinney behind the rectory paddock, and consoled himself with a pipe of tobacco. Here in the wood, with the summer sun streaming through the trees and a book and his pipe, the boy forgot his cares and had an interval of that rest without which I verily believe his life would have been insupportable. Of course, Ernest was made to look for his lost property, and a reward was offered for it, but it seemed he had wandered a good deal off the path, thinking to find a lark's nest, more than once, and looking for a watch and purse on Battersby Wipes was very like looking for a needle in a bundle of hay. Besides, it might have been found and taken by some tramp, or by a magpie, of which there were many in the neighborhood, so that after a week or 10 days the search was discontinued, and the unpleasant fact had to be faced that Ernest must have another watch, another knife, and a small sum of pocket money. It was only right, however, that Ernest should pay half the cost of the watch. This should be made easy for him, for it should be deducted from his pocket money in half-yearly installments extending over 2, or even it might be 3 years. In Ernest's own interests, then, as well as those of his father and mother, it would be well that the watch should cost as little as possible, so it was resolved to buy a second-hand one. Nothing was to be said to Ernest, but it was to be bought, and laid upon his plate as a surprise just before the holidays were over. Theobald would have to go to the county town in a few days, and could then find some second-hand watch which would answer sufficiently well. In the course of time, therefore, Theobald went, furnished with a long list of household commissions, among which was the purchase of a watch for Ernest. Those, as I have said, were always happy times. When Theobald was away for a whole day certain, the boy was beginning to feel easy in his mind, as though God had heard his prayers, and he was not going to be found out. Altogether the day had proved an unusually tranquil one, but, alas! It was not to close as it had begun. The fickle atmosphere in which he lived was never more likely to breed a storm than after such an interval of brilliant calm. And when Theobald returned, Ernest had only to look in his face to see that a hurricane was approaching. Christina saw that something had gone very wrong, and was quite frightened lest Theobald should have heard of some serious money loss. He did not, however, at once unbosom himself, but rang the bell and said to the servant, "Tell Master Ernest I wish to speak to him in the dining room." Chapter 41. Long before Ernest reached the dining room, his ill-divining soul had told him that his sin had found him out. What head of a family ever sends for any of its members into the dining room if his intentions are honorable? When he reached it, he found it empty, his father having been called away for a few minutes unexpectedly upon some parish business, and he was left in the same kind of suspense as people are in after they have been ushered into their dentist's anteroom. Of all the rooms in the house, he hated the dining room worst. It was here that he had had to do his Latin and Greek lessons with his father. It had a smell of some particular kind of polish or varnish which was used in polishing the furniture, and neither I nor Ernest can even now come within range of the smell of this kind of varnish without our hearts failing us. Over the chimneypiece there was a veritable old master, one of the few original pictures which Mr. George Pontifex had brought from Italy. It was supposed to be a Salvator Rosa, and had been bought as a great bargain. The subject was Elijah or Elisha, whichever it was, being fed by the ravens in the desert. There were the ravens in the upper right-hand corner with bread and meat in their beaks and claws, and there was the prophet in question in the lower left-hand corner looking longingly up towards them. When Ernest was a very small boy, it had been a constant matter of regret to him that the food which the ravens carried never actually reached the prophet. He did not understand the limitation of the painter's art, and wanted the meat and the prophet to be brought into direct contact. One day, with the help of some steps which had been left in the room, he had clambered up to the picture and with a piece of bread and butter traced a greasy line right across it from the ravens to Elisha's mouth, after which he had felt more comfortable. Ernest's mind was drifting back to this youthful escapade when he heard his father's hand on the door, and in another second Theobald entered. "Oh, Ernest," said he, in an offhand, rather cheery manner, "there is a little matter which I should like you to explain to me, as I have no doubt you very easily can." Thump, 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 went Ernest's heart against his ribs, but his father's manner was so much nicer than usual that he began to think it might be after all only another false alarm. "It had occurred to your mother and myself that we should like to set you up with a watch again before you went back to school." "Oh, that's all," said Ernest to himself, quite relieved, "and I have been today to look out for a second-hand one which should answer every purpose so long as you're at school." Theobald spoke as if watches had half a dozen purposes besides time-keeping, but he could hardly open his mouth without using one or other of his tags, and answering every purpose was one of them. Ernest was breaking out into the usual expressions of gratitude, when Theobald continued, "You are interrupting me," and Ernest's heart thumped again. "You are interrupting me, Ernest. I have not yet done." Ernest was instantly dumb. "I passed several shops with second-hand watches for sale, but I saw none of a description and price which pleased me, till at last I was shown one which had, so the shopman said, been left with him recently for sale, and which I at once recognized as the one which had been given you by your Aunt Alethea. Even if I had failed to recognize it, as perhaps I might have done, I should have identified it directly it reached my hands, inasmuch as it had E.P., a present from A.P., engraved upon the inside. I need say no more to show that this was the very watch which you told your mother and me that you had dropped out of your pocket." Up to this time Theobald's manner had been studiously calm, and his words had been uttered slowly, but here he suddenly quickened and flung off the mask as he added the words, "or some such cock-and-bull story, which your mother and I were too truthful to disbelieve. You can guess what must be our feelings now." Ernest felt that this last home thrust was just. In his less anxious moments he had thought his papa and mamma green for the readiness with which they believed him, but he could not deny that their credulity was a proof of their habitual truthfulness of mind. In common justice he must own that it was very dreadful for two such truthful people to have a son as untruthful as he knew himself to be. Believing that a son of your mother and myself would be incapable of falsehood, I at once assumed that some tramp had picked the watch up and was now trying to dispose of it. This, to the best of my belief, was not accurate. Theobald's first assumption had been that it was Ernest who was trying to sell the watch, and it was an inspiration of the moment to say that his magnanimous mind had at once conceived the idea of a tramp. You may imagine how shocked I was when I discovered that the watch had been brought for sale by that miserable woman Ellen, Here Ernest's heart hardened a little, and he felt as near an approach to an instinct to turn as one so defenseless could be expected to feel. His father quickly perceived this and continued, "Who was turned out of this house in circumstances which I will not pollute your ears by more particularly describing." I put aside the horrid conviction which was beginning to dawn upon me, and assumed that in the interval between her dismissal and her leaving this house, she had added theft to her other sin, and having found your watch in your bedroom had purloined it. It even occurred to me that you might have missed your watch after the woman was gone, and, suspecting who had taken it, had run after the carriage in order to recover it, but when I told the shopman of my suspicions he assured me that the person who left it with him had declared most solemnly that it had been given her by her master's son, whose property it was, and who had a perfect right to dispose of it. He told me further that, thinking the circumstances in which the watch was offered for sale somewhat suspicious, he had insisted upon the woman's telling him the whole story of how she came by it, before he would consent to buy it of her. He said that at first, as women of that stamp invariably do, she tried prevarication, but on being threatened that she should at once be given into custody if she did not tell the whole truth, she described the way in which you had run after the carriage, till as she said you were black in the face, and insisted on giving her all your pocket money, your knife and your watch. She added that my coachman John, whom I shall instantly discharge, was witness to the whole transaction. Now, Ernest, be pleased to tell me whether this appalling story is true or false?" It never occurred to Ernest to ask his father why he did not hit a man his own size, or to stop him midway in the story with a remonstrance against being kicked when he was down. The boy was too much shocked and shaken to be inventive. He could only drift and stammer out that the tale was true. "So I feared," said Theobald. "And now, Ernest, be good enough to ring the bell." When the bell had been answered, Theobald desired that John should be sent for, and when John came Theobald calculated the wages due to him and desired him at once to leave the house. John's manner was quiet and respectful. He took his dismissal as a matter of course, for Theobald had hinted enough to make him understand why he was being discharged, but when he saw Ernest sitting pale and awestruck on the edge of his chair against the dining-room wall, a sudden thought seemed to strike him, and turning to Theobald he said in a broad northern accent which I will not attempt to reproduce, "Look here, master, I can guess what all this is about. Now before I goes I want to have a word with you." "Ernest," said Theobald, "leave the room." "No, Master Ernest, you shan't," said John, planting himself against the door. "Now, master," he continued, "you may do as you please about me. I've been a good servant to you, and I don't mean to say as you've been a bad master to me, but I do say that if you bear hardly on Master Ernest here I have those in the village as'll hear on't and let me know, and if I do hear on't I'll come back and break every bone in your skin, so there." John's breath came and went quickly, as though he would have been well enough pleased to begin the bone-breaking business at once. Theobald turned of an ashen color, not, as he explained afterwards, at the idle threats of a detected and angry ruffian, but at such atrocious insolence from one of his own servants. "I shall leave Master Ernest, John," he rejoined proudly, to the reproaches of his own conscience. "Thank God and thank John," thought Ernest. "As for yourself, I admit that you have been an excellent servant until this unfortunate business came on, and I shall have much pleasure in giving you a character if you want one. Have you anything more to say?" "No more nor what I have said," said John sullenly, "but what I've said I means and I'll stick to, character or no character." "Oh, you need not be afraid about your character, John," said Theobald kindly, "and as it is getting late, there can be no occasion for you to leave the house before tomorrow morning." To this there was no reply from John, who retired, packed up his things, and left the house at once. When Christina heard what had happened she said she could condone all except that Theobald should have been subjected to such insolence from one of his own servants through the misconduct of his son. Theobald was the bravest man in the whole world, and could easily have collared the wretch and turned him out of the room, but how far more dignified, how far nobler had been his reply. how it would tell in a novel or upon the stage, for though the stage as a whole was immoral, yet there were doubtless some plays which were improving spectacles. She could fancy the whole house hushed with excitement at hearing John's menace, and hardly breathing by reason of their interest and expectation of the coming answer. Then the actor, probably the great and good Mr. Macready, would say, "I shall leave Master Ernest, John, to the reproaches of his own conscience." Oh, it was sublime! What a roar of applause must follow! Then she should enter herself, and fling her arms about her husband's neck, and call him her lion-hearted husband. When the curtain dropped, it would be buzzed about the house that the scene just witnessed had been drawn from real life, and had actually occurred in the household of the Reverend Theobald Pontifex, who had married a Miss Libby, etc., etc. As regards Ernest, the suspicions which had already crossed her mind were deepened, but she thought it better to leave the matter where it was. At present she was in a very strong position. Ernest's official purity was firmly established, but at the same time he had shown himself so susceptible that she was able to fuse two contradictory impressions concerning him into a single idea, and consider him as a kind of Joseph and Don one in one. This was what she had wanted all along, but her vanity being gratified by the possession of such a son, there was an end of it. The son himself was not. No doubt if John had not interfered, Ernest would have had to expiate his offense with ache, penury and imprisonment. As it was, the boy was to consider himself as undergoing these punishments, and as suffering pangs of unavailing remorse inflicted on him by his conscience into the bargain, but beyond the fact that Theobald kept him more closely to his holiday task, and the continued coldness of his parents, no ostensible punishment was meted out to him. Ernest, however, tells me that he looks back upon this as the time when he began to know that he had a cordial and active dislike for both his parents, which I suppose means that he was now beginning to be aware that he was reaching man's estate. Chapter 42. About a week before he went back to school, his father again sent for him into the dining room, and told him that he should restore him his watch, but that he should deduct the sum he had paid for it, for he had thought it better to pay a few shillings rather than dispute the ownership of the watch, seeing that Ernest had undoubtedly given it to Ellen, from his pocket money, in payments which should extend over 2.5 years. He would therefore have to go back to Rubborough this half year with only 5 shillings pocket money. If he wanted more, he must earn more merit money. Ernest was not so careful about money as a pattern boy should be. He did not say to himself, "Now I have got a sovereign which must last me 15 weeks, therefore I may spend exactly 1 shilling and 4 pence in each week, and spend exactly 1 and 4 pence in each week accordingly." He ran through his money at about the same rate as other boys did, being pretty well cleaned out a few days after he had got back to school. When he had no more money, he got a little into debt, and when as far in debt as he could see his way to repaying, he went without luxuries. Immediately he got any money he would pay his debts. If there was any over he would spend it, if there was not, and there seldom was, he would begin to go on tick again. His finance was always based upon the supposition that he should go back to school with £1 in his pocket, of which he owed say a matter of 15 shillings. There would be 5 shillings for sundry school subscriptions, but when these were paid, the weekly allowance of 6 pence given to each boy in Hull, his merit money, which this half he was resolved should come to a good sum, and renewed credit, would carry him through the half. The sudden failure of 15 was disastrous to my hero's scheme of finance. His face betrayed his emotions so clearly that Theobald said he was determined to learn the truth at once, and this time without days and days of falsehood before he reached it. The melancholy fact was not long in coming out, namely, that the wretched Ernest added debt to the vices of idleness, falsehood, and possibly, for it was not impossible, immorality. How had he come to get into debt? Did the other boys do so? Ernest reluctantly admitted that they did. With what shops did they get into debt? This was asking too much. Ernest said he didn't know. "Oh, Ernest, Ernest," exclaimed his mother, who was in the room, "do not so soon a second time presume upon the forbearance of the tenderest-hearted father in the world. Give time for one stab to heal before you wound him with another. This was all very fine, but what was Ernest to do? How could he get the school shopkeepers into trouble by owning that they let some of the boys go on tick with them? There was Mrs. Cross, a good old soul, who used to sell hot rolls and butter for breakfast, or eggs and toast, or it might be the quarter of a fowl with bread sauce and mashed potatoes, for which she would charge 6d. If she made a farthing out of the sixpence, it was as much as she did. When the boys would come trooping into her shop after the hounds, how often had not Ernest heard her say to her servant girls, "Now then, you wanches, get some cheers." All the boys were fond of her, and was he, Ernest, to tell tales about her? It was horrible. "Now look here, Ernest," said his father with his blackest scowl, "I am going to put a stop to this nonsense once for all. Either take me fully into your confidence, as a son should take a father, and trust me to deal with this matter as a clergyman and a man of the world, or understand distinctly that I shall take the whole story to Dr. Skinner, who, I imagine, will take much sterner measures than I should." "Oh, Ernest, Ernest," sobbed Christina, "be wise in time, and trust those who have already shown you that they know but too well how to be forbearing." No genuine hero of romance should have hesitated for a moment. Nothing should have cajoled or frightened him into telling tales out of school. Ernest thought of his ideal boys. They, he well knew, would have let their tongues be cut out of them before information could have been wrung from any word of theirs. But Ernest was not an ideal boy, and he was not strong enough for his surroundings. I doubt how far any boy could withstand the moral pressure which was brought to bear upon him. At any rate, he could not do so, and after a little more writhing he yielded himself a passive prey to the enemy. He consoled himself with the reflection that his papa had not played the confidence trick on him quite as often as his mamma had, and that probably it was better he should tell his father, than that his father should insist on Dr. Skinner's making an inquiry. His papa's conscience jabbered a good deal, but not as much as his mamma's. The little fool forgot that he had not given his father as many chances of betraying him as he had given to Christina. Then it all came out. He owed this at Mrs. Cross's, and this to Mrs. Jones, and this at the Swan and Bottle public house, to say nothing of another shilling or sixpence or two in other quarters. Nevertheless, Theobald and Christina were not satiated, but rather the more they discovered the greater grew their appetite for discovery. It was their obvious duty to find out everything, for though they might rescue their own darling from this hotbed of iniquity without getting to know more than they knew at present, were there not other papas and mammas with darlings whom also they were bound to rescue if it were yet possible? What boys, then, owed money to these harpies as well as Ernest? Here, again, there was a feeble show of resistance, but the thumbscrews were instantly applied, and Ernest, demoralized as he already was, recanted and submitted himself to the powers that were. He told only a little less than he knew or thought he knew. He was examined, re-examined, cross-examined, sent to the retirement of his own bedroom and cross-examined again. The smoking in Mrs. Jones' kitchen all came out, which boys smoked and which did not, which boys owed money and, roughly, how much and where, which boys swore and used bad language. Theobald was resolved that this time Ernest should, as he called it, take him into his confidence without reserve, so the school list which went with Dr. Skinner's half-yearly bills was brought out, and the most secret character of each boy was gone through seriatim by Mr. and Mrs. Pontifex, so far as it was in Ernest's power to give information concerning it, and yet Theobald had on the preceding Sunday preached a less feeble sermon than he commonly preached, upon the horrors of the Inquisition. No matter how awful was the depravity revealed to them, the pair never flinched, but probed and probed, till they were on the point of reaching subjects more delicate than they had yet touched upon. Here Ernest's unconscious self took the matter up and made a resistance to which his conscious self was unequal, by tumbling him off his chair in a fit of fainting. Dr. Martin was sent for and pronounced the boy to be seriously unwell. At the same time he prescribed absolute rest and absence from nervous excitement. So the anxious parents were unwillingly compelled to be content with what they had got already, being frightened into leading him a quiet life for the short remainder of the holidays. They were not idle, but Satan can find as much mischief for busy hands as for idle ones, so he sent a little job in the direction of Battersby which Theobald and Christina undertook immediately. It would be a pity, they reasoned, that Ernest should leave Rubborough. Now that he had been there 3 years, it would be difficult to find another school for him, and to explain why he had left Rubborough. Besides, Dr. Skinner and Theobald were supposed to be old friends, and it would be unpleasant to offend him. These were all valid reasons for not removing the boy. The proper thing to do, then, would be to warn Dr. Skinner confidentially of the state of his school, and to furnish him with a school list annotated with the remarks extracted from Ernest, which should be appended to the name of each boy. Theobald was the perfection of neatness. While his son was ill upstairs, he copied out the school list so that he could throw his comments into a tabular form, which assumed the following shape, only that of course I have changed the names. 1 cross in each square was to indicate occasional offense, 2 stood for frequent, and 3 for habitual delinquency. And thus through the whole school. Of course, in justice to Ernest, Dr. Skinner would be bound over to secrecy before a word was said to him, but, Ernest being thus protected, he could not be furnished with the facts too completely.